Welcome, dear listener. My name is Mr. Sleepy, and I make history to sleep to. So find a comfortable position. Close your eyes if you have not already, and allow yourself to drift. There is no need to remember dates or names. There is only the story, unfolding slowly, like a tapestry woven in the quiet hours of the night. Tonight, we begin a journey into the past, a journey into a world on the edge of catastrophe, a journey into the Black Death.
Imagine, if you will, a world in the middle of the 14th century.
Not a world of shadows and silence, but one of vibrant, often brutal, life.
It is a world of sound.
The clang of a blacksmith's hammer on a French village anvil,
The cry of merchants hawking silks in the bustling bazaars of Constantinople.
the lowing of cattle being driven along the muddy thoroughfares of an English market town, and the solemn chants of monks echoing
Through the stone cloisters of a German abbey. This is Europe on the precipice. For centuries,
its population had been growing, a slow, relentless expansion pushing against the boundaries of arable land.
forests were felled, marshes were drained, and new villages sprouted on the frontiers of Christendom. By the 1340s, this growth had reached a critical point.
The continent was teeming with an estimated
75 to 80 million people, a density Europe would not see again for nearly 200 years.
This was a society built on a delicate three-pillar structure. At the top, the spiritual power of the church,
A universal institution that touched every life from the lowliest serf to the mightiest king. Its calendar dictated the rhythm of existence, the planting.
the harvest, the holy days.
Below, the secular power of kings, dukes and knights, their authority often contested, their lands in a constant state of negotiation through marriage.
Inheritance, and all too often, war. And beneath both, forming the vast, silent foundation, were the peasants. They were the tillers of the soil, the herders of sheep.
The vintners and the woodcutters, their lives were governed by the seasons,
By the Lord's demands, and by the capricious nature of weather. For the vast majority, life was short, often harsh.
but it was a known harshness.
It was a world of tradition.
Of familiar paths walked by generations, of local loyalties stronger than any national identity.
They knew their place, their village, their lead lord.
The concept of a distant,
Continent-wide calamity was utterly alien to their experience.
their world was local, tangible, and for all its hardships, it was theirs. Yet, beneath this veneer of established order,
Currents of change and stress were already flowing. The great warming period that had allowed
Europe's population to boom was beginning to falter.
the weather had grown unpredictable. Harvests in the early 1340s had been poor,
Leading to creeping famine in some regions. The 100 Years' War between England and France was in its early,
destructive stages, leaving a trail of displaced peasants.
pillaged countryside and mercenary bands willing to fight for any coin.
Trade routes, the lifeblood of cities like Florence,
Bruges and Venice were long, complex, and vulnerable.
they stretched eastward to the Black Sea ports of Kaffa and Tana, carrying silks from Cathay.
Spices from the Indies, and
In the holds of Genoese and Venetian galleys, something else, something no one had a name for yet.
to understand the arrival of the pestilence, one must first travel not to Europe, but far to the east.
To the vast and varied landscapes of Central Asia. Here,
Amidst the rolling grasslands and the rugged mountain passes, a complex ecosystem existed in a fragile equilibrium.
it was a world of nomadic herders, of trading caravans winding along the ancient Silk Road,
And of bustling urban centers like Isikul and Sarai.
the capital of the Golden Horde. This was the crucible. It was here, in the marmot burrows of the steppes, that a bacterium named Yersinia pestis lived in a quiet, ancient cycle. It circulated among wild rodent populations, marmots, gerbils, and ground squirrels carried by fleas perfectly adapted to these hosts. This was its natural reservoir, a slow-burning, perpetual fire in the wilderness. Occasionally, a spillover would occur.
A local outbreak among human populations, who trapped these animals for their fur. It was a known, localized hazard, a cost of doing business on the frontier.
But something was different in the early
1,340 seconds, climatic fluctuations,
may have altered the balance.
pushing the wild rodent populations into closer contact with human settlements,
A local epizootic, an animal epidemic began.
to spread with a ferocity that the usual, isolated outbreaks could not match.
The Mongols, whose vast empire had for a century enforced
A Pax Mongolica
that allowed the Silk Road to flourish.
provided the infrastructure for the plague's first great leap. Their system of relay stations, or YAB, allowed messages, merchants,
And armies to travel with unprecedented
speed from the Sea of Japan to the Black Sea. It was this very system of movement,
this unprecedented connection, that now served a different master. A merchant caravan carrying furs or grain
could unknowingly transport a cargo of infected fleas in their bales. A group of soldiers on the move could carry the infection in their own bodies.
The bacterium,
having jumped from its wild rodent hosts to the commensal rats
that lived in human habitations,
found a perfect new partner.
The black rat, Rattus rattus, was a tireless traveller.
It thrived in the holds of ships,
in the grain stores of caravanserais,
and in the crowded homes of cities. Its flea, the Xenopsilochiopis, was a vector of terrifying efficiency.
The first major
recorded tremor of what was to come struck the trading city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula in 1346. A
Mongol army, led by Jani Beg of the Golden Horde,
had been besieging the Genoese-held city for months.
The siege dragged on, and within the Mongol camp, the disease began to take hold.
It was a siege within a siege.
The Chronicle of Gabriel D.
Musi tells of the Mongol forces being devastated by a mysterious and lethal affliction, their soldiers dying in droves.
In an act of early biological warfare, either born of desperation or cold calculation, the Mongols are said to have used catapults to hurl the plague.
Before the disease could be fought, it had to be understood.
But in the 14th century, understanding was a luxury the physicians and scholars could not afford.
Their world was one governed by the principles of Galen and Hippocrates,
inherited from antiquity and filtered through the lens of the church. The dominant medical theory was that of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile,
and yellow bile.
Health was a state of balance among these humours.
Disease was a corruption, an imbalance, often attributed to miasma, or foul, poisonous air.
This could be caused by astrological alignments, earthquakes,
or the putrid fumes from swamps and unburied corpses. It was a framework that made sense of the world,
based on observation of symptoms and a deeply held belief in a cosmos, where the celestial and the terrestrial were intimately linked. When the plague arrived, this was the lens through which the most
learned minds of the age would try to interpret it. They would look to the stars, to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345,
as the celestial trigger for the corruption of the air.
They would prescribe the burning of aromatic woods and the
wearing of sweet-smelling pomanders
to ward off the deadly miasma.
They would recommend bleeding, purging,
and strict diets to rebalance the humours of the afflicted.
All of it, tragically, was futile against a bacterial infection. The true enemy was invisible,
a concept that had no place in their intellectual world. Yersinia pestis is a bacterium of deceptive simplicity. Its primary mode of transmission is through the bite of an infected flea.
When a flea feeds on the blood of a sick rat,
the bacteria multiply in its gut, eventually forming a blockage that prevents the flea from digesting its meal.
The flea, now ravenous, will bite repeatedly, each time regurgitating a mass of bacteria directly into the host's bloodstream. This is the most common pathway for the disease to spill over
from the rat population into the human.
From that single flea bite, the bacteria travel to the nearest lymph node,
where they begin to multiply with terrifying speed. The body's response is to send an army of immune cells to the site, resulting in the most famous and feared symptom of the plague, the bubo.
These were the excised, or even apple-sized, swellings, typically in the groin, armpit, or neck. They were agonizingly painful, hot to the touch, and a clear sign that the body's defenses were being overwhelmed. But the bacterium was not content to remain in the lymph nodes. From there, it could enter the bloodstream,
leading to the septicemic form of the disease.
This version was faster, deadlier.
It caused a darkening of the skin as blood clotted under the surface, giving rise to the terrifying moniker, the Black Death.
It was a sign that the infection was systemic, spreading to the vital organs. Most terrifying of all was the pneumonic form,
the most direct and efficient transmission.
The ships that departed Kaffa in the late summer of 1346 did not know what they carried.
To the Genoese merchants and sailors aboard those galleys,
the immediate concern was survival. They had escaped a brutal siege, leaving behind the stench of rotting corpses and the sight of their comrades
falling to a mysterious illness.
The sea was their salvation. They sailed westward, navigating the familiar waters of the Black Sea,
bound for the Bosporus and the great city of Constantinople.
The voyage would take several weeks, time enough for the crew to tend to their wounded, to mourn their dead,
and to hope that whatever had plagued the camp at Kaffa
had been left
behind on the Crimean shore.
But hope, in the face of such an enemy, was a fragile thing. Below deck, in the dark,
cramped quarters where grain sacks were stored and cargo was lashed to the hull,
the black rats went about their business. They had been on these ships for as long as there had been ships.
Stowaways in the truest sense. Now they were dying.
The fleas that fed on them,
Sensing the cooling bodies of their hosts, sought new warmth.
they crawled upward, out of the hold, into the living spaces where the sailors,
Slept on hard bunks, and the merchants counted their remaining coin.
a bite on the ankle, a bite on the wrist, unnoticed in the dim lamplight. Then came the fever.
Then came the swellings.
When the first sailor collapsed on the deck, his neck swollen to the size of a fist, the crew knew that the horror had followed them. They had no choice but to press on, their numbers dwindling, their ship becoming a floating tomb. By the time the galleys entered the Golden Horn, the great natural harbour of Constantinople,
Some vessels were said to have arrived with no one left to drop anchor.
the next port of call was Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily. In October of 1347,
A fleet of Genoese galleys arrived in the harbour.
carrying not silks and spices but something far more sinister. The chronicler Michele da Piazza, a notary in the city, left a vivid account of what transpired.
He wrote that the Genoese ships entered the port.
But their crews were stricken with a strange and terrible malady.
Death clung to their very bones, he said.
The Sicilians, seeing the swellings on the sailors' bodies and the dark patches on their skin,
Knew instantly that this was no ordinary sickness. They ordered the ships out of the harbour, but it was too late.
the disease had already slipped ashore.
Carried perhaps by a single infected flea that had hitched a ride on a merchant's cloak,
Or by a rat that had scampered across a mooring line before anyone could raise the alarm.
within days, Messina was in the grip of the pestilence.
What began as a few cases in the port district exploded into a full-scale epidemic. Families locked themselves in their homes, only to find that the disease had entered with them,
Physicians, clad in their traditional robes,
visited the sick, and became sick themselves. Priests who administered last rites died before they could finish the prayers.
the dead accumulated in the streets, and soon there was no one left to bury them.
Michele da Piazza wrote of the terror that gripped the city,
Describing how fathers abandoned their dying sons,
how wives fled from their husbands,
how the bonds of family and friendship dissolved in the face of an enemy that,
showed no mercy and respected no station. The city authorities, desperate to contain the spread, ordered the Genoese ships to be burned in the harbour,
along with any goods that had been offloaded,
but the fire did nothing to stop the invisible enemy already.
moving through the narrow streets and crowded tenements.
The structure of medieval society,
With its dense urban centres, also played a crucial role. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London were crowded.
unsanitary, and teeming with life. In Florence, a city of perhaps 80,000 people before the plague, the streets were narrow, the houses were built close together,
And sanitation was rudimentary at best. Human waste was often thrown into the streets, attracting vermin of all kinds.
The Arno River, which ran through the city,
Was both a source of water and a receptacle for refuse.
the poor lived in overcrowded tenements,
Sometimes a dozen people to a single room, sharing their space with rats, fleas, and lice.
When the plague entered such an environment, it found conditions perfectly suited to its spread. The pneumonic form, transmitted through a simple cough or sneeze,
Could move through a crowded household in a matter of hours.
the bubonic form,
Carried by fleas, thrived in the unsanitary conditions where rats were abundant.
the wealthy were not spared,
For they too lived in close proximity to servants.
to animals and to the bustling life of the city. The poet Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence,
Described the horror in his introduction to the Decameron. He wrote of citizens avoiding one another,
neighbors abandoning neighbors.
and parents forsaking their own children as if they were strangers.
He described how the sheer number of dead overwhelmed the city, how there were no longer enough priests to perform last rites, no longer enough graves to hold the bodies.
The sacred rituals that had ordered.
Life for centuries were abandoned, out of necessity.
The dead were loaded onto carts and carried to mass graves, where they were laid in tiers like goods in a warehouse.
The world, Boccaccio wrote, seemed to have been turned upside down.
And in many ways it had.
The plague was not merely killing people, it was unraveling the very fabric of society, challenging every institution, every belief.
Every assumption upon which medieval life had been built,
The structure of medieval society,
with its dense urban centres, also played a crucial role. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London were crowded.
unsanitary, and teeming with life. In Florence, a city of perhaps 80,000 people before the plague, the streets were narrow, the houses were built close together,
And sanitation was rudimentary at best. Human waste was often thrown into the streets, attracting vermin of all kinds.
the Arno River, which ran through the city,
was both a source of water and a receptacle for refuse. The poor lived in overcrowded tenements, sometimes a dozen people to a single room, sharing their space with rats, fleas, and lice. When the plague entered such an environment, it found conditions perfectly suited to its spread. The pneumonic form, transmitted through a simple cough or sneeze, could move through a crowded household in a matter of hours. The bubonic form, carried by fleas, thrived in the unsanitary conditions where rats were abundant. The wealthy were not spared, for they too lived in close proximity to servants, to animals, and to the bustling life of the city. The poet Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence, described the horror in his introduction to the Decameron. He wrote of citizens avoiding one another,
neighbors abandoning neighbors,
and parents forsaking their own children as if they were strangers.
He described how the sheer number of dead overwhelmed the city, how there were no longer enough priests to perform last rites, no longer enough graves to hold the bodies.
The sacred rituals that had ordered
life for centuries were abandoned, out of necessity.
The dead were loaded onto carts and carried to mass graves, where they were laid in tiers like goods in a warehouse.
The world, Boccaccio wrote, seemed to have been turned upside down.
And in many ways it had.
The plague was not merely killing people, it was unraveling the very fabric of society, challenging every institution, every belief,
every assumption upon which medieval life had been built. By the spring of 1348,
the plague had achieved what no army, no famine, and no natural disaster had ever accomplished.
It had breached the natural barriers that had long
protected Europe from the calamities of the East. The Alps, the Pyrenees, the great rivers, all proved powerless against an enemy that travelled not over mountains but through the bodies of men and women who crossed them.
The disease moved northward from Marseille, following the Aurenne Valley into the heart of France.
It moved westward from Sicily and Italy, crossing the Tyrrhenian Sea and climbing the mountainous spine of the Apennines to reach the cities of Tuscany and Umbria. It moved eastward from Constantinople,
through the Aegean Islands and into the Balkans.
By the summer of that year, it was in Paris, the largest city in Christendom. The French king, Philip VI, had received warnings from his physicians and his courtiers, but there was little he could do. The plague did not respect royal decrees. It did not stop at city gates or castle walls. It entered Paris through its markets, its inns,
its bustling streets where merchants from across France and beyond came to trade.
The University of Paris, one of the great centers of learning in Europe, closed its doors as scholars fled or fell ill. The Hôtel Dieu, the city's main hospital, was overwhelmed with the sick and dying.
Chroniclers wrote of the stench of death that hung over the city, of the constant ringing of funeral bells,
of the carts that rolled through the streets,
collecting bodies so numerous that they could no longer be given individual burials.
The dead were laid in great trenches outside the city walls,
layer upon layer, with only a thin covering of earth between them.
Paris, the city of light, had become a city of shadows. From France, the plague radiated outward along
the ancient roads that connected the kingdom to its neighbors.
It travelled west to the ports of Normandy and Brittany, carried by merchants and by peasants fleeing the contagion. It travelled north to Flanders,
the wealthy cloth-producing region whose cities Bruges, Ghent, Ypres were among the most densely populated in northern Europe.
The cloth trade, which depended on the movement of wool from England
and finished goods to markets
across the continent,
became a highway for the disease. Ships that had called at infected ports carried
the plague to the estuaries of the Scheldt and the Meuse. By the autumn of 1348, it had reached England. The exact point of entry is uncertain, but tradition holds that it arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset,
or perhaps at Southampton or Bristol.
What is certain is that by November, the plague was spreading through the southern counties of England with a speed and ferocity that stunned a population that
had thought itself safe.
The chronicler of the Abbey of Meaux in Yorkshire wrote that the pestilence
was so great that men could not remember the like, nor find words to describe it. The impact of such a calamity on the human psyche is difficult to overstate.
For the men and women of the 14th century, life was understood within a framework of meaning provided by the Church. Suffering was not unknown. Famine, war, and disease were familiar companions, but suffering was supposed to have purpose. It was a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or a preparation for the life to come. But the Black Death defied all such explanations. It did not spare the pious.
It did not spare the clergy who administered the sacraments.
It did not spare the innocent. It struck children and the elderly with equal indifference.
It moved so quickly that there was often no time for confession,
no time for last rites, no time for the rituals that allowed a Christian soul to depart the world in a state of grace. This was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the plague,
It did not merely kill, it killed without warning, without mercy.
and often without the consolation of the church. Priests died alongside their flocks, and soon there were not enough ordained men to hear confessions. Pope Clement VI, in Avignon,
Was forced to grant permission for laymen, even women, to hear.
the confessions of the dying.
A concession that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The very structure of salvation
The careful architecture of sin
and penance that had guided
Christian life for centuries seemed to be collapsing. In the face of such incomprehensible suffering, people sought explanations.
Some turned to astrology, believing that a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had corrupted the air.
Others blamed earthquakes, which had been reported in various parts of Europe in the years preceding the plague,
Believing that the fumes released from the earth had poisoned the atmosphere. These were not irrational beliefs,
they were the best efforts of educated.
meant to understand a catastrophe, using the tools available to them.
But for the common people, less concerned with celestial mechanics than with the immediate,
Horror of watching their neighbors die.
the search for meaning often took darker forms. The plague demanded a cause, and a cause required a culprit. In many towns and cities, the blame fell upon the Jews. The accusation was not new. Jews had been scapegoated for centuries.
Accused of poisoning wells, of ritual murder, of conspiring against Christians.
But the Black Death gave these accusations a new and terrible urgency. In the spring of 1348,
Rumors began to spread.
that the plague was the result of a Jewish
Conspiracy to poison the water supplies of Christendom. The rumors were absurd. The plague was killing
Jews as readily as Christians, but reason had little purchase in a world consumed by fear. The first major pogrom occurred in Provence, in the town of Toulon, where Jews were dragged from their homes and murdered. From there, the violence spread. In Savoy, authorities extracted confessions under torture, which were then used to justify.
The third revelation was the most unexpected. One afternoon in mid-May,
As she was walking back from her hives,
she noticed a patch of ground near the spring that she had never paid much attention to before. It was a small clearing, perhaps 10 feet across, bounded by an old stone wall that had been half buried in brambles and ivy.
the brambles had died back over the winter, and in the spring sunshine, the clearing was carpeted with a plant she did not recognize. It had small, rounded leaves and tiny white flowers.
And when she knelt to examine it, she was struck by a scent so powerful and so strange that she sat back on her heels.
Disoriented, it was the scent of mint,
But not any mint. She knew stronger, sharper, with an undertone of something almost citrus.
She pulled a leaf and crushed it between her fingers,
And the scent intensified,
filling her head with a clarity she had not known she needed.
She brought a sample to Father Michael.
Who examined it with the careful attention he gave to all plants,
He turned the leaf over in his fingers,
smelled it, tasted it cautiously.
and then sat back with a look of wonder on his face.
This is pennyroyal, he said.
But not any pennyroyal I have ever seen.
It is wild, you see, not cultivated. It has been growing here for centuries,
Perhaps hidden under the brambles.
waiting for someone to clear the ground. The old herbals speak of it as a plant of great power.
It is said to clear the mind, to ease the spirit, to protect against the ill humours of the air.
He looked at Alund with a new respect.
Your bees will love it.
And so, I think, will we. The discovery of the pennyroyal became, in the days that followed.
A kind of symbol for the valley's new relationship with its own land.
They had always lived here,
Had always taken what they needed from the soil and the stream and the forest, but they had never really looked. Now, with nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, they began to look, and what they found astonished them. There were herbs growing in the hedgerows that Father Michael had never seen before.
plants that the old herbals described as rare or even mythical. There were mushrooms in the woods that old
Tom recognized as delicacies his grandfather had spoken of, varieties that had been forgotten or overlooked for generations.
There were fish in the stream that the villagers had never troubled to catch.
Species that preferred the deep pools and the shaded reaches. Fish that tasted of the flint and the chalk and the clear water of the spring.
The work of the spring was the work of planting.
And this year it had a significance it had never had before. In other years, the planting had been a routine, a task performed with the expectation that the market would provide
what the fields could not. This year, the fields were all they had, and they approached them with a reverence that transformed the work into something almost sacred. Sir Reginald, drawing on his agricultural texts,
had devised a rotation that would preserve the soil for the years to come.
the great common field, which had been planted in wheat the previous autumn,
Was left fallow this spring, but it was not left empty.
The villagers sowed it with clover and vetch, plants that would feed the soil as surely as they would feed the sheep that would graze there in the summer. The smaller fields, those that had been fallow the previous year,
were planted in barley and oats, crops that would provide grain for bread and porridge and fodder for the animals.
Will the miller, who had become something of an expert on the soil, spent hours walking the fields,
his hands in the earth, testing its texture, its moisture, its warmth.
He had always thought of himself as a man who worked with wood and water, but the earth, he discovered,
had its own demands, its own rhythms,
and he found himself drawn to it with a fascination he had not anticipated. He began to keep a record of the weather, noting the direction of the wind, the amount of rain, the temperature of the air.
He consulted with old Tom about the signs that the shepherd
used to predict the seasons,
and with Father Michael about the saints' days that marked the agricultural calendar.
He became, without quite meaning to, the village's authority on the land,
the one to whom the others turned when they had questions about when to plant,
when to harvest, when to expect the first frosts. Marjorie, too, found her work expanding. The herb garden behind the church had grown from a small
plot to a substantial operation,
with beds of medicinal plants arranged according to Father Michael's system, each plant labelled with its name and its uses.
She had become adept at the preparation of remedies, at the drying and storing of herbs,
at the blending of tinctures and salves. But it was the discovery of the pennyroyal that had opened a new door for her. The wild plants of the valley, she realized,
were a pharmacy that had never been fully catalogued, a resource that had been overlooked for generations. She began to explore the hedgerows and the woods, the meadows and the slopes, collecting samples of every plant she did not recognize,
pressing them between sheets of paper,
recording their locations and their properties.
Father Michael, who had once been her teacher,
now found himself learning from her,
and he did so with a humility that surprised even himself.
"I came to this valley thinking I knew something about herbs," he said one evening in the longhouse, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "But I knew nothing. I knew the herbs of the garden, the cultivated plants, the ones the books describe. But the valley has its own herbs, its own medicines, its own secrets, and Marjorie, it seems, is the one who is teaching them to me."
Marjorie, who had been sitting by the fire with her notebook open on her lap, looked up at this with a flush of pleasure. She had come such a long way from the girl who had wept for a betrothed she could not see, who had thought her life was over because the road had been closed. She had found in the herbs and the soil a purpose that was deeper than any romance, a calling that had claimed her as surely as the bees had claimed Elund. The spring planting was followed by the summer growing, and the summer growing was a time of watchfulness. The villagers had always watched the crops, of course, but never with this intensity. Every day, someone would walk the fields, checking the progress of the barley, the oats, the vegetables in the cottage gardens. They noted the first appearance of the ears, the swelling of the grain, the changes in colour that marked the approach of harvest. They watched the sky for clouds, the fields for pests, the stream for the level of the water that fed the irrigation channels Will had dug, and they watched the bees, whose work was so intimately connected to the work of the fields, whose pollination was the secret to the abundance of the fruit trees and the vegetables.
Elund had never been more in demand. Her honey was traded for everything: flour from Will, vegetables from the cottage gardens, meat from the common slaughter, wool from the sheep, leather from the tanner who had set up his workshop by the stream. But it was not just the honey that people wanted. It was her knowledge, her quiet expertise, her ability to read the signs that the bees gave when the bees were active. The weather would be fair when they clustered at the entrance of the hive. Rain was coming when they swarmed. It was a sign of abundance, of new beginnings. The villagers, who had once thought of the bees as Elund's strange obsession, now saw them as a kind of oracle, a source of wisdom that could guide them through the uncertainties of their isolated life.